Ladies and gentlemen, we live in an age that celebrates curiosity. We open books with the reverence of pilgrims, as if every cover hid a sacred shrine. And truly many do. Literature has shaped souls, nurtured minds, and whispered truths that echo through eternity. But not every whisper is a hymn. Some are hisses. There are books, yes, even beautifully bound, critically acclaimed books that serve not to illumine, but to obscure. They do not invite wonder, they conjure confusion. And in our quest for knowledge, we have begun to shelve poison beside poetry, vice beside virtue, as if the ink did not matter. Today, I speak not of banning books, nor of cowering from culture, but of discernment. A house is not made holy by stained glass windows, but by the spirit that dwells within. And likewise, a book is not safe simply because it is fictional, clever, or ancient. Some books are doors, and not all doors open to rooms with light. There are at least 7 works commonly found in modern homes that act, not metaphorically but quite literally, as spiritual invitations. Books that treat witchcraft as harmless curiosity, portray darkness as depth, and mock the divine as superstition. These are not imaginative tales with clear moral boundaries. No, they are books where spells are real, power is praised regardless of its source, and the demonic is aestheticized into something beautiful, seductive, or empowering. Dear friends, we are not dealing with neutral. The enemy of souls has never been so artful, so literary. And when we invite these volumes into our homes, we do not merely welcome stories. We welcome presences. Your bookshelf is not just a display, it is a spiritual altar. What you read, you grant access to your imagination. What you imagine, you begin to believe. And belief, dear listeners, is the birthplace of reality. I urge you, walk your home as one entrusted with a sacred domain. Inspect your library with the seriousness of a priest inspecting the sanctuary. Do not be afraid of knowledge, but be fiercely loyal to the truth. For in the end, there are only 2 kinds of books, those that lead you closer to the light, and those that slowly extinguish it. Books are spiritual gateways, not in some vague metaphorical sense, but in a real and potent way that shapes the inner life of the reader. Every book is a vessel of the author's imagination, philosophy, and worldview. When we read, we do more than absorb information. We open ourselves to the spirit behind the words. Imagination, that noble faculty by which we make sense of the invisible, is the most vulnerable entry point to the soul. And through imagination, stories either elevate or erode the moral and spiritual structure within us. Books are not merely ink and paper. They are invitations, some to truth and virtue, others to confusion and compromise. This is especially true in the case of literature that deals with the supernatural, the occult, or themes of power and knowledge beyond the natural order. The danger is not in acknowledging that such powers exist. The danger lies in how they are portrayed, romanticized, neutralized, or glorified. When a book presents witchcraft as a tool rather than a transgression, it reshapes our moral intuitions. What once was recognized as a dangerous counterfeit becomes reimagined as a personal path to empowerment. When sorcery becomes synonymous with self-actualization, we are not merely reading a story. We are being catechized into a counterfeit religion. The most subtle shift occurs not when evil is presented as evil, but when it is disguised as good. This is not a new tactic. Throughout history, evil has always worn the garb of enlightenment, freedom, or beauty. What was once feared for its destructive nature is now welcomed for its narrative complexity. A spell is no longer a summons to dark forces, it is a metaphor for creativity. A demon is no longer a destroyer of souls, but a misunderstood anti-hero. And thus, with every turn of the page, the reader's guard is lowered until fiction becomes formation. This transformation happens quietly. Few would knowingly invite corruption into their home, but many do it unwittingly through what they read and reread. The atmosphere of a home is not merely shaped by decor or conversation, but by the unseen influence of the stories it absorbs. A home filled with literature that treats darkness with respect, fascination, or humor becomes spiritually porous. The moral compass begins to tilt slowly and subtly as sympathies shift from the sacred to the profane. Even those who do not believe in spiritual warfare must concede that books shape beliefs, and beliefs shape behavior. How much more so when the book in question deals with things expressly spiritual in nature. If a doorway is opened, something will enter. What that something is depends entirely on what was invited. To read without discernment is not a mark of openness. It is a surrender of guardianship. We must remember that when we open a book, we are not only looking into a world is looking into us. Some worlds heal, some haunt, and the gate is far easier to open than it is to close. Witchcraft is not fictional in impact, regardless of how cleverly it is dressed in metaphor or how innocently it is woven into stories. While the literary world often uses magic as a symbol representing imagination, power, rebellion, or self-discovery, its spiritual implications are not erased by artistic intent. In many cultures and belief systems, witchcraft is not merely a narrative device. It is a real practice rooted in the invocation of spiritual forces, manipulation of unseen realities, and alignment with powers outside the divine order. When books romanticize, normalize, or celebrate these practices, they do more than entertain. They influence, awaken, and in some cases invite. Fiction is a powerful shaper of belief because it bypasses the rational mind and appeals directly to the imagination. It does not demand proof, it only asks for participation. The more convincing the world, the more we lower our defenses, and the more susceptible we become to what that world presents as true, beautiful, or desirable. This is especially dangerous when witchcraft is portrayed not as a threat, but as a solution. When it becomes the means by which characters overcome oppression, discover identity, or wield justice. These stories subtly shift the reader's perception. Witchcraft is no longer a violation of divine boundaries but a birthright of the bold. What is imagined repeatedly eventually becomes familiar, and what is familiar becomes acceptable. Through repetition, the reader becomes desensitized. Spells and rituals that once provoked caution or fear are now repeated aloud in curiosity or jest. Terms once associated with the occult are now used casually in conversation. Symbols once considered dark are worn as fashion or aesthetic. This is not merely cultural evolution, it is spiritual erosion. The portrayal of witchcraft as art, empowerment, or entertainment strips it of its moral weight and cloaks it in charm. The impact does not stop with the individual. When these books are brought into the home, especially homes with children or young readers, the effect multiplies. Curiosity is stirred. Imitation follows. The boundary between fantasy and practice blurs. Children, whose minds are still forming, begin to experiment first in play, then in pursuit. The language of spells, the crafting of charms, the dabbling in divination, these are not uncommon behaviors among those who have absorbed enough stories where such practices are central and celebrated. Those who believe in spiritual realities recognize that symbols, words, and actions can carry weight beyond intention. A fictional spell recited in fun can still function as an invocation. A ritual imagined in prose can echo a real rite practice for centuries. The spirit realm does not distinguish between literary and literal when the doorway is open through desire, fascination, or imitation. The influence is not in whether the book claims truth, but in whether the reader gives consent. The result is that witchcraft, though wrapped in fiction, leaves a real imprint. It influences thought patterns, opens spiritual doors, and reshapes moral instincts. To treat it lightly because it is fictional in form is to ignore the very real effect it has on the soul. Stories shape belief. Belief shapes reality, and witchcraft, however playfully disguised, is never neutral. Discernment over censorship is the path of wisdom in a world overflowing with words. The temptation to respond to darkness in literature with outright prohibition is understandable, but it is not always effective, nor is it always righteous. Censorship, though sometimes necessary in extreme cases, can become a blunt instrument, suppressing not only what is harmful, but also what is complex, redemptive, or misunderstood. Discernment, by contrast, is a scalpel. It cuts with precision. It does not silence voices, it filters them. It teaches the reader not only what to reject, but why to reject it, and it strengthens the conscience in the process. Discernment requires an active, not passive engagement with what we consume. It is the practice of asking questions as we read. What spirit does this book carry? What does it say about truth, goodness, and the divine? Does it glorify darkness or expose it? Does it encourage virtue or invite confusion? These are not questions rooted in fear, but in reverence. Reverence for the human soul. Reverence for the unseen realities that literature either honors or distorts. Unlike censorship, which assumes that danger lies solely in access, discernment recognizes that the true danger lies in unquestioned access. A book might be physically present on a shelf and yet spiritually ineffective if the reader approaches it with guarded awareness. At the same time, a book that is celebrated and uncritically embraced, even if subtly corrosive, can do great harm. Discernment is not about never encountering error. It is about being prepared to meet it with clarity. This is especially vital in households where children or young readers are present. Parents cannot shield their children from every questionable idea forever, nor should they aim to, but they can train them to be readers who notice what lies beneath the surface. Instead of merely saying "don't read that," the discerning parent says, let's read it together and talk about what's true, what's twisted, and what's missing. This approach builds moral resilience, not just obedience. It prepares the young to navigate the world, not merely hide from it. Discernment honors freedom while protecting integrity. It acknowledges that humans are not just consumers of media, but image bearers of God, whose minds and hearts are shaped by what they behold. Therefore, it is not an act of weakness to avoid certain books. It is an act of stewardship. Not every story is worthy of hospitality in the soul. Some deserve to be engaged, others to be tested, and still others to be turned away at the threshold. Discernment respects both truth and the reader. It trusts the power of truth to withstand scrutiny and the power of falsehood to disguise itself. It teaches us to be alert without being afraid, informed without being indifferent. In an age where everything is permitted and nothing is examined, discernment is not just a virtue. It is a lifeline. Beauty can deceive in ways that are both subtle and profound. It has the unique power to disarm our critical faculties, to cloak danger in charm, and to persuade the heart even when the mind remains unsure. We often associate beauty with goodness, as if something lovely in form must also be pure in substance. But history, art, and theology alike warn us that this is not always so. Evil rarely appears as grotesque. It arrives in pleasing shapes, adorned in language that sings and images that dazzle. Its most dangerous form is not when it threatens, but when it enchants. In literature, this dynamic is especially potent. A beautifully written book has the capacity to gain access to the reader's imagination without resistance. The elegance of the prose, the sophistication of the plot, the depth of the characters, all of these can draw us in so completely that we fail to question what lies beneath the surface. The moral structure of the story may be skewed, the lines between good and evil may be blurred or even reversed. But the loveliness of the language creates an illusion of trustworthiness. We assume that what is well crafted must also be wise, that what stirs the emotions must also elevate the soul. This is precisely where beauty becomes a tool of deception. When darkness is veiled in aesthetic excellence, it bypasses the soul's natural defenses. The reader no longer evaluates content, they are swept along by style. Witchcraft, for instance, is often portrayed in literature not as grotesque rebellion against divine order, but as art, empowerment, or liberation. The rituals are romanticized, the symbols stylized, the consequences softened or ignored entirely. What might otherwise provoke caution is now viewed with admiration, even aspiration, because it is presented beautifully. This deception extends beyond mere ideas. It reshapes affections. We begin to feel sympathy for what we should reject. We admire characters who align with spiritual rebellion because they are drawn with complexity, humor, and grace. We overlook their alignment with evil because they are interesting, tragic, or courageous. In this way, our emotional loyalties are quietly reoriented. What we once knew to be wrong is now relatable, and what is dark becomes attractive. Not because we have changed our beliefs, but because we have allowed beauty to do our thinking for us. True discernment requires that we look beyond appearance. It means asking whether something is good, not merely whether it is beautiful. It demands we resist the seduction of surface-level brilliance and weigh what lies beneath. This is not to say that beauty is inherently untrustworthy. Far from it. True beauty, rightly ordered, reflects the divine, but counterfeits exist, and when beauty is divorced from truth, It becomes not a window to the holy, but a mask for the profane. The most insidious lies are not those shouted in ugliness, but those whispered through elegance. That is the danger of beauty misused. It persuades us not with force, but with charm, and leads the heart astray while the eyes are still admiring the view. Home libraries are sacred spaces, not because of the furniture or the shelves that hold the books, but because of what those books represent, the ideas, values, and spiritual atmospheres we choose to welcome into our lives. A home is more than a physical structure, it is a sanctuary. It is the place where souls are formed, where children learn what is normal and noble, where the imagination is stirred and character is shaped. The books that dwell within it are not passive decorations. They are voices, presences, and teachers. Every book we bring into our home carries with it an essence of its author, its worldview, and its moral vision. We do not often think of a bookshelf as an altar, but in a very real sense, it functions as one. Just as sacred objects in a place of worship orient the soul toward the divine, the literature we keep within reach or display with pride signals what we esteem. Some books uplift, ennoble, and deepen our connection with truth. Others confuse, degrade, or glamorize falsehood. What we read regularly becomes the moral wallpaper of our lives, present even when unnoticed, subtly shaping how we see the world. This is especially significant in homes where children and teenagers are growing. Young minds are impressionable, not just in terms of what they believe, but in how they come to believe. A home library teaches them not only content, but also habits of thought. What is worth spending time on? What is considered normal? What kinds of questions matter? If books that blur the line between light and darkness, or that present witchcraft, spiritual rebellion, or moral relativism as compelling or harmless dominate the space, then the formation that occurs is not neutral, it is directionally spiritual. The presence of a book in the home communicates acceptance. Even if it is unread, its place on the shelf signals a level of trust or admiration. Over time, as the eye becomes familiar with the titles and the hand grows comfortable reaching for them, their ideas are no longer foreign. They become household companions. This is not to argue for paranoia, nor to suggest that every book must meet a rigid standard of agreement. But there is wisdom in evaluating which voices are given space to speak in the quiet corners of our homes. Curating a home library is an act of spiritual stewardship. It is not merely about what entertains or educates, but what nourishes. Just as we are careful with the food we eat and the company we keep, so we must be careful with the words we welcome. Some books are wholesome meals for the mind and heart. Others are spiritual junk food, or worse, poison with a pleasant aroma. The library of a home reflects the priorities of that home. It can be a wellspring of wisdom and light, or a subtle source of confusion and compromise. What we place on those shelves matters, not just for us, but for those who will one day grow up among them. Stories shape beliefs in ways more powerful and enduring than facts ever could. Long before doctrines are memorized or philosophies debated, stories seep into the soul and quietly form the lens through which we see the world. They do not argue, they show. They bypass resistance and engage the imagination, the emotions, and the will all at once. A well-told story does not demand agreement. It evokes sympathy, identification, and understanding. And in this quiet influence, it becomes one of the most formative forces in a person's life. When we read, we don't merely observe characters, we live with them. We suffer their losses, celebrate their victories, adopt their questions, and often embrace their conclusions. The story gives us a temporary home in another's worldview, and even when we close the book, that worldview leaves an imprint. Whether intentional or not, every story carries a moral weight. It teaches us who the heroes are, what values are worth fighting for, and what evils are worth opposing or ignoring. Repeated exposure to particular themes or character arcs subtly rewrites our expectations of reality. This influence is magnified when it comes to stories involving the supernatural, the mysterious, or the moral boundaries of good and evil. When witchcraft, for instance, is portrayed not as rebellion against spiritual order, but as a tool of empowerment or creativity, the reader begins to see it not through the lens of truth, but through the lens of narrative empathy. The practice that was once seen as dangerous or wrong is now attached to characters we admire. It becomes something beautiful, liberating, or even noble, not because it is true, but because it is compelling. The power of story is not limited to fiction. Myth, parable, film, and even modern entertainment carry the same influence. The consistent portrayal of moral relativism, spiritual independence, or self-deification across multiple stories does not just entertain, it catechizes. These narratives shape the moral and spiritual instincts of the reader or viewer more deeply than most sermons or lectures. They reach the heart before the mind has time to object. This is why the stories we consume, and especially the stories we allow to shape young minds, matter so deeply. Beliefs formed in story are often held more deeply than beliefs formed in argument, because they are tied to emotion, imagination, and identity. And once a belief is rooted in the imagination, it feels like a personal truth, something experienced, not merely taught.